and welcome to the online digital platform Discourse, an archive of ideas. This series by the Economic Society SRCC is an attempt to support and rekindle the growth of ideas and opinions among students. Through this platform, we invite distinguished personalities from various fields to discuss relevant ideas and provide the youth with a better understanding of the world around them. For this episode, we are honored to have amongst us Mr. Ajay Chhibber. Sir is the first Director General of India's Independent Evaluation Organization and is currently appointed as the Chief Economic Advisor at the Federation of India's Chamber of Commerce and Industry. He has served as the United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Assistant Administrator for UNDP. Prior to that, he worked at the World Bank for nearly 25 years on a range of development issues, managing its programs. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Very glad to be here and thank you for your interest. I'm so glad to be with the Economic Society for your college. And I was also at DU at one time, so I know Delhi University quite well. Thank you for having me.
Our first question for today is, you had recently written an article revolving around the overestimation of GDP numbers as pointed out in Dr. Arvind Subramanian's paper. A couple of months back, there were also speculations regarding the manipulation of employment figures and fiddling of government in CSO's working. What would be your opinion pertaining to how the current government has been bringing out figures as well as major amendments and policy changes in the economy?
So I think ever since the rebasing of the GDP series, there have been questions about the data itself. First of all, if you recall, the GDP growth rate from the old series to the new series jumped up by about 2 percentage points. And then there was another exercise done where they took the series backwards all the way back, and then suddenly the growth rate during the NDA period became higher than the growth rate during the two UPA 10-year periods. So, and particularly what was surprising was the uptick in the growth rate now versus the UPA 1, when there was a period of very high growth. Most people regarded that as a period of very high growth. So there have been lots of questions about this new rebasing and new methodology. The methodology itself is probably bringing it to better, global standards. Also, there's new company information data. But the problem is that, in all these things, if you've done statistical work, you'll realize that nothing comes clean and simple in statistics. So you have to splice the data and you have to play with it in order to make it fit what you're trying to do. And it is in that fitting and splicing and assumptions that have been made that I think there are some serious questions. Particularly when I looked at it, for me, the issue was less with the nominal and more with the deflators that had been estimated. And that can make a big difference to real GDP growth rates, particularly in the services sector. And then there are these issues with the company data in the manufacturing sector also. Now, all this is pretty well known. And, if you look at what business people are looking at, they are really not focusing on the GDP series. They are looking at a whole range of 17, 18 indicators. Now, what Arvind did was he took all this data and ran some cross-country regressions as well as within-country regressions and put a point estimate of around 2.5% overestimation for this period 2011-12 to 2016-17. And I think people have attacked him for that, and he's again defended himself in a new paper that was presented at NCAR recently. That said, my sense is that it is not easy using cross-country regressions to estimate how much growth rate has been overestimated. His estimate of 2.5% overestimation is probably a little on the high side. But there are still remaining doubts about whether India is actually growing at 7+% as it was, reported in the last 5-6 years. And this controversy will continue unless we are able to fully disentangle what the CSO has done and how it has done it. And perhaps it's best to set up a committee to look into it, independent committee, or a CSO should make available all its information and researchers can go at it and decide how to do. So there is some overestimation, I feel, maybe not as much as what Arvind Subramaniam thinks it is. In any case, I think people are moving on, and most business and financial houses in India or even in the rest of the world are really not paying that much attention to the GDP numbers and using a range of other indicators like a Li Ka-shing index for China. The Chinese prime minister didn't trust his own data, so he created his own index for Chinese economic activity and became known as the Li Ka-shing index. So perhaps we need a Li Ka-shing index for India. I have proposed such an index to FICCI, the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and so we may be in that direction. But there are many, private houses that are already producing such indicators, some leading and coincident indicators for India.
So, how is this like this Chinese indicator which you just talked about? How is this indicator a better representative of than compared to the normal indicators that we are currently following?
No, I think what they do. So the idea here is not to create new data. It is using existing data. So, for example, the Chinese Li Ka-shing indicator used data like freight traffic movement, credit growth, tourist arrivals, indicators that are, more quantitative numeric indicators that cannot be easily fudged, right? You know how much freight traffic is, you know how much transport is, you know how much electricity consumption is, you know how much credit offtake is, you know how much. So the idea is to try and see that in the past, which of these indicators was better correlated with GDP and how correlated were they? And then to say, okay, I'm not trusting the projected GDP series or the current GDP series, but I do have these other real indicators. And I'm going to use these real indicators to get a better sense of what's happening to economic activity. So there are about 17 or 18 such indicators that people are using in the business sector. And also they are tailoring them to their particular interests. So if you're in the mining business, you may use a slightly different set of indicators than if you're in the manufacturing business, or if you're in the service business, or if you're in the hotel industry, or you're selling cars, or you're selling refrigerators. People have to adapt then. But these are real indicators that are available, and they are often available 6 months before the GDP numbers come out. So these are called leading indicators.
So moving on, we see that there's a slowdown in the Indian economy, which is now apparent from the data such as weaker GDP growth and plummeting auto sales and falling core inflation. These have prompted calls for collective action, which has led to continuous widening of the fiscal deficit. So according to you, what led to the growth slowdown in the first place, and are there any reformatory measures that we can adopt to control this phenomenon?
So I think there has been a slowdown, and whether you trust the GDP data or not, but even the existing GDP data is showing a very big slowdown. We are below 6% growth now, and all the major projections for India have been cut back. RBI has cut back, IMF has cut back, World Bank has cut back, ADB has cut back. So everybody is thinking that the economy is going to now grow slower than before. Now, you can only boost the economy very temporarily through fiscal measures. You can say increase your spending, government spending for a short while. But in the end, what really sustains growth is investment, particularly private investment. And private investment has been down for a very long period of time, particularly corporate investment has been down for ever since the last, crisis in 2007 and 8. So this revival is very important. And all the research shows that there are 3, 4 major indicators that affect private investment in order to get growth back up. One is the exchange rate, which is very important. And our exchange rate has been overvalued by about 15 to 20%. A lot of capital came into India and kept the exchange rate overvalued. And this is something that needs to be corrected. And it will also help boost exports. If you don't allow the exchange rate to stay appreciated, then exports will be boosted. And in fact, exports have suffered because of the appreciation. The other very important factor is credit to the private sector. And this is where this crowding out effect of the fiscal becomes very important, because the government says our fiscal deficit is come exactly at 3.4% of GDP. But as the CAG has shown, the actual fiscal deficit is much larger, because what the government has done has done off balance sheet borrowing, means it has asked the Food Corporation of India or ONGC, etc., to pay certain items which should have been in the budget by borrowing, in a way, off balance sheet and not showing that as part of the fiscal deficit. So the actual fiscal deficit of the central government is closer to 5% of GDP. Then you add to that the state fiscal deficits, plus other entities that have borrowed. And the total public sector borrowing requirement, which is a new concept that India needs to adopt. It's called the PSBR. And some of you may be interested in and may have learned about it in your lectures as well. This is a broader concept of how much is the total fiscal deficit of the public sector as a whole, because that's what matters in the markets. We have a certain amount of savings. How much is the government taking away from those savings, and what's left for the private sector? The government should reduce its hit on the market. And this is where I think the problem comes of trying to boost the economy through the fiscal as well, because the more you spend and the more you borrow, the less resources you're leaving for the private sector, which then starts to hurt private sector growth. So that's another very important factor that has to be taken into account. Now, it is true that the composition of government spending matters, because if you look at public capital spending, that has a positive effect on private investment. Because if you build more roads, if you have more electricity, if you have more of these sort of so-called what I call public infrastructure, then it helps to bring in more private activity and more private investment. So the size of the government matters, fiscal deficit matters, but also the composition matters. So these are the variables that at a macro level that the government has to play with. At the micro level, it has other variables like corporate taxes. We have the highest corporate taxes in the world. The OECD study shows that our corporate tax rate is not 30%, it's actually closer to 45, 46%, highest in the world. So when you want to revive economic activity, the fiscal is one part of it. But there are all these other factors that have to be brought into play as a part of a macro package to boost the economic activity going forward. So there's no quick fix here. I think they will have to work on a range of these issues. They will have to try and reduce the public sector borrowing requirement by reducing further the fiscal deficit. They'll have to change the composition of the expenditure. They will have to work on the exchange rate. They will have to work on a range of these factors like corporate taxes, etc. which are hurting business sentiment and activity.
Sure, sir. So we see that India is facing a silent tax crisis
Right.
owing to a shortfall in tax revenues, and the government's budget suggests that it may have grossly underestimated the problem, which makes it pro-cyclic when it ideally should be a counter-cyclic. What are your views on this? And secondly, do you think the budget presented would help fully reverse the problem in current financial year?
So I think there are two separate issues. One is that they have may not have used the right numbers to present in the budget, because there was the initial estimate, then there's a revised estimate, and the revised estimate numbers were quite different from the initial estimate numbers. And instead of using those revised estimate numbers and rebasing all their calculations there, they went ahead in the budget with the initial estimate numbers. The revised estimate budget, as you correctly point out, shows the silent crisis, which is that the tax intake was actually by 1% of GDP less than in the initial estimates. But by not using those revised estimates to rebase the budget calculations between the interim budget and the final budget, they have left this gap unexplained, which means that the actual revenue that will be required to come in 2019-20 will be much higher, because the revised estimates were much lower. So the increase will have to be much higher. And an increase of a magnitude that is, not possible and never been done historically as well. So the gap is bigger, and they will have to find ways to fill this gap as well. So that's one problem. Then you raise the issue of pro-cyclicality and contra-cyclicality. Now, in India, it's hard to judge this, because there are people who believe India doesn't have a normal business cycle like you have in advanced countries, right? There are others who say, no, India does have a business cycle. Anyway, that's an academic debate, and in fact, some of you may want to write papers on those kinds of things, or whether India does have a business cycle or not. My old institute, National Institute of Public Finance, has some papers on this, and you all can look there to see what the latest state of play is on that. There have been then many estimates to determine whether India's fiscal policy is pro-cyclical or contra-cyclical. And there are, again, like in any academic exercise, two different views. So within India, all the studies I have seen show that India's fiscal policy is pro-cyclical, meaning that when growth is going well, the fiscal actually adds more to it, because revenues come in, so they spend more money. This is a typical situation of a developing country, by the way. If you look internationally, there is a big difference between developed countries and developing countries. Typically, a developed country will follow a contra-cyclical fiscal policy. So because they have these transfer mechanisms. So if economy is not doing well, unemployment rises, they have natural transfers of money to the unemployed part of the economy, to the unemployed workers, to help them tide over. Most developing country fiscal policy is pro-cyclical, meaning that when you're doing well, you have a boom, revenue goes up, spending goes up, and they don't save for the rainy day and when the economy will turn down. So India, when you look internationally, and all the studies that I have seen at the World Bank and other places, India is sort of in the middle. It's neither very pro-cyclical nor very contra-cyclical. Although Indian studies itself show that India is more pro-cyclical. So there's an academic debate and worth further investigation by young researchers on this. So this is an open area for research. That said, it is true that in India, when and what matters, I think, is also whether components of the fisc are pro-cyclical or not. For example, if capex is more pro-cyclical or contra-cyclical, that makes a bigger difference to growth than if other components of expenditure. I mean, there are wages and salaries and interest payments that are pretty standard. I mean, nothing is going to change on them for a long period of time, right? They don't change that much. So the change actually comes in India is that when the revenue goes down, it's capex that gets cut first. So it's the capex part that is more pro-cyclical than other recurrent expenditures, and that makes a big difference to growth. So I'm just giving you different aspects of this problem. This is an area that needs more research. What we are doing, there was the idea that India should forget about the size of the fiscal deficit and focus more on public debt dynamics. Look at sort of what is absorbable by India in terms of public sector debt. But of course, we are already breached the 60% limits, 40% for the central government and 20% for the state governments on public debt. So we need to actually bring that down a little bit. Some people believe that, of course, faster growth will also bring, so when you look at debt dynamics, what matters not is just how much you borrow, but then what are you going to do with the borrowing? Because suppose you borrow and then your growth picks up, then the denominator in the public debt dynamics starts to bring the overall debt ratios down. So it's a pretty interesting area for more research on India. But this idea that we can just borrow more and spend more on infrastructure and somehow that will solve our problem, as some people have proposed, is not that easy, because once the money comes into the hands of politicians, there's no guarantee that it will be spent actually for genuine good, and it may be given away in freebies here and there and everywhere as well. So it's not it's like something where you have a clean answer, but it is possible, and I have shown this in many countries in my work. For example, I was working in Turkey once, and they had a similar situation where growth was not happening. So we tried to show that if you were to increase the size of the fiscal deficit, but you were to invest it all in infrastructure, in particular types of infrastructure, then the positive growth effects would outweigh in the debt dynamics would outweigh the extra borrowing. And this is possible for India. Suppose they borrowed an additional, say, trillion rupees, 1 lakh crore rupees, and gave it all to Mr. Gadkari to spend on faster road construction, etc. That could have very positive long-run, economic effects, which could then actually bring down your debt dynamics. I mean, it's possible that you can run a scenario, especially if you also change the exchange rate. And I have a paper on this in NIPFP, working paper series. You can Google it there. It's on private investment. And there I have run some of these simulations to show what kind of package would actually boost growth without affecting the debt dynamics.
Okay. So in your opinion, it's not an area of concern because if India or any other developing country, for a matter of fact, follows a pro-cyclic budget or a pro-cyclical.
Pro-cyclical is not good, because pro-cyclical means is when the economy is doing well, you increase government spending to boost it further. That's not a good thing. You should follow contra-cyclical, but the way to do contra-cyclical is also important. So I'm not in favor of pro-cyclical. Most developing countries are pro-cyclical. That just means that revenue comes in because the economy is doing well. And say it may be a commodity boom. Suppose you are a big mineral exporting economy. and suddenly the price of copper or something goes up, right? Or oil, and you get a lot of money. Actually, you should be saving that money now for the time when the economy is going to go down. So you should be every country should be following contra-cyclical. But even a contra-cyclical policy, how to do that is very important, you know. So when your economy is going down, how to boost it up is also very important. And if you have not kept money in a stabilization fund for that time, you can then borrow. But if you borrow for infrastructure, that's good. So contra-cyclical is a good thing. Pro-cyclical is not good. And then how to do contra-cyclical is also important.
Okay, sir. So a year ago, the government said it would stop targeting revenue deficit as it believed that the segregation of capital spending and revenue spending was not valid for a growing economy like India. So, which needs constant upgrading of infrastructure. Yet we see that economists tend to see the trend of a higher revenue deficit as a sign of poor fiscal management. So, in your opinion, what could be an alternate measure to gauge the efficacy of the fiscal policy?
No, I think that's a mistake. I think revenue deficit is important because the you know so capex is important, right? So if I could increase my fiscal deficit from 3 to 4%, but if I use that extra 1% all in capex, that's going to have big growth effects. So it's going to may end up in fact having positive effects on my debt dynamic. But I can agree that capex is not enough. There are expenditures which are showing on the revenue side, like on health or education, teacher salaries, that could be equally important to spending on roads and railways and power, right? So we could expand the definition of to something called developmental spending. Okay. And focus on that. And we could say, okay, these components of our total expenditure actually have positive developmental impacts, right? And so, for example, teacher salaries, more teachers, more salaries, more health workers, which are normally considered, recurrent expenditure, can very positive developmental impact, as much perhaps even as spending on roads and rail and things like that. So this distinction between revenue and non-revenue can be expanded further, can be modified if one feels that the current definitions are not correct. But to just say we are not going to bother about it at all is also not correct, I think. And they should find some measures that determine what we call the quality of fiscal spending. The quality of fiscal spending is very important. If you think of our budget, total budget now in India, we are, and you compare it to East Asian countries which grew very rapidly, 10, 20 years ago. What we need is more spending on education. So we are spending about 4.3% of GDP on education when you add it all up, center, states. We need to be spending close to 6%. When you look at our health spending, it's around 1.4%. We need to be spending about 3%. So those are areas that need to go up. I would even argue defense spending needs to go up. We have the lowest, if you take out our defense spending is now the lowest that it has ever been in 50 years. And we are feeling the pressure of that because we are, using MiGs against F-16s in a little fight against Pakistan. So we have neglected our defense. So we need to change our capex is very low on infrastructure. We have one of the lowest now ever in our history. So we need to increase all these. But we need to then reduce somewhere else, right? Or increase our revenue. Now, two things we could do is increase our revenue. One is we could probably improve our GST and then hope that GST will add 2 to 3% of GDP to our revenue intake. We could change our direct tax system to have a much wider base and increase direct tax revenue. We could start selling off all these. I've done a big study on these public enterprises. We have about $100 billion of capital locked in public enterprises. We could at least sell half of those and get $250 billion over the next 5 to 10 years. That would add about 1% of GDP to our revenue. We could reduce the total subsidies through better measures like direct income support, etc. Because we are spending a lot of money on this Food Corporation of India and fertilizer subsidies, wasteful subsidies, free electricity, which is ruining our agriculture because we are pumping out all the water from the ground. So we could reform our subsidy system and get another 2% of GDP. So we need a development, we need some thinking like this over the next 5, this can't happen from 1 year to the next. Over the next 5 years, how shall we change the orientation of our fiscal in a more developmental way and think of developmental expenditure rather than this distinction between revenue deficit and non-revenue.
So moving on to our last question. So considering our GDP growth rate is continuously plummeting, a stable fiscal policy is a must for economic growth to revive. So in your opinion, how far away are we from a stable fiscal policy? And in India's present context, how imperative is the trade-off between sacrificing fiscal consolidation on one hand and achieving higher growth numbers in the economy on the other hand?
Yeah, so I think I partially answered that question with my previous answer, which is, I think of it as how do you get to a more, we have had stability in the sense that we have tried to have control on our fiscal spending, of course. But the quality of our spending is very bad, as for the reasons I just gave you in terms of how we need to shift the composition of our spending. So what is more important to me is changing the composition of our spending in a more developmental way. More education spend, more health spend, more even defense spend, more infrastructure spend, less of these subsidies, less of normal, wages and salaries that the government does. People forget that, we look at China, right? China did a big economic reform in 1980, and we did it in 1979, 1980. We did ours in 91, 92. 15 years after China did its big economic reform, they did a very major administrative reform. They reduced the size of their government employees by 50%. There was a Prime Minister, Chu Rongji, who carried out a major administrative reform. In Malaysia, when they do economic reforms, they pay equal attention to administrative reform. So when we are thinking of economic reform, we are not thinking enough about what is the administrative side that will actually be needed for a modern 21st century economy. We are still running the entire fiscal apparatus is spending, and the way we are doing it is still, although we have made some changes with Aadhaar and with mobile and all these things, but pretty much the administrative structure we are running is still from colonial days, right? We have the same administrative setup. There is the district collector, and then there is these various departments, and that's how money goes down. So we need a major rethink and modernization of the administrative system, the judicial system, police. Everything is stuck in courts, and court system is very inefficient. So we need that kind of a big reform. Now, Dr. Manmohan Singh had set up, when he was Prime Minister, set up the Administrative Reforms Commission under Mr. Moily. They produced a report, 1,600 recommendations, but nothing happened. Now, I think this government, Modi's government, the second term especially, must pay attention to this issue as well. That, to have a stable and developmental fiscal state, that is the kind of state we need to grow faster, grow 8+. We need to reform on the administrative side as well, including tax collection, and bring a much wider widen the tax base itself. But you need an reformed administrative system to be able to do this. So here, I think is very important that more than fiscal deficit going up a little bit here or there, what is more important is a reorientation of the fiscal system that we have in a much developmental manner, working closely between the center and the states as well. And from the states, there is very little devolution to the third tier of government, to municipal government, because in most developed countries, municipal government provides the bulk of your services, day-to-day services. Your water, your electricity, your roads, your schools are provided in most developed countries at the municipal or local level. And in India, that level is, so short of resources that it's missing. So we need a reorientation, a modernization of our fiscal system in these directions. Whether the deficit is 3, 3.4, 3.3, these minor fine-tuning, as I call it, fine-tuning a very obsolete car is not going to give you, we need to go from 100 horsepower to 300 horsepower vehicle. You keep fine-tuning the 100 horsepower vehicle and maybe get 110 out of it. You need a new engine. And a new fiscal system is needed to get us from 100 horsepower to say 250 to 300 horsepower. That's the analogy that I think we need to have. And the other thing is that, we have now, partly because we have not been able to change our fiscal system, we have also ended up with a huge NPA problem in the banking system. These things are interrelated because we then said, okay, we need to finance infrastructure, let's go and borrow from the banking system. We ended up then with creating a huge NPA problem in the banking system. And now we are stuck with that also. So, all these parts are interrelated. And actually, the latest economic survey does a good job of showing some of these issues, especially also on employment. Since your first question was on employment, people think of employment as a matter of just creating, how many jobs can you create? Actually, what you need is an ecosystem that generates economic activity that then creates employment for people, right? And that's where you need to focus rather than, okay, I need a separate employment policy and I need a separate growth policy. If you get growth, in sufficiently competitive manner, the jobs will come with it. Employment will come with it.
So this brings us to the end of our interaction. So it was pleasure interacting with you, sir. Thank you for your invaluable time.